Hi, my name's Dave Goulson. I'm Professor of Biology at the University of Sussex, and I'm a specialist in insects. And I'd like to talk to you today about insect declines and biodiversity declines more generally, how serious they are and what we can all do to halt and reverse them, which of course is the really important bit. So, there's a growing body of evidence showing beyond doubt that insects are in rapid decline. Some of the best data are from the UK, where we monitor butterfly populations very accurately and have been doing so since the 1970s. And British butterfly populations overall are down about 50% since 1976. So I was 11 years old in 1976. So in my lifetime, the populations of butterflies have halved. My kids growing up are experiencing half as many as I did, which is rather sad. It isn't just happening in the UK, this is actually a global phenomenon. I'll just share one other bit of evidence from beyond the UK. So these data, forgive my dog barking, these data are from Germany, where German enthusiasts have been running malaise traps since the late 1980s. Malaise traps catch flying insects, and the chart shows you the average weight of insects caught per day per trap and how it changed between 1989 and 2016. And it actually fell by 76%, so seemingly 3/4 of the flying insects in Germany have disappeared in a 26-year period. When these data were published, it actually got newspaper coverage around the world, and I think it was the beginnings of a sort of broad-scale appreciation that we really do have a problem. There are lots of insects for which we don't have long-term population counts in the way we do for example, for butterflies, but we do have maps that show the distributions, the ranges, and how they've changed over time. And these two show generally some pretty alarming contractions. So, for example, this is the shrill carder bumblebee, one of my favourites, a lovely little bee. It used to be common, as you can see, all over the southern half of Britain, but as time's gone on, it's declined. And sadly, today, if you want to see one of these bees, they're down to, well, so in 2000, they were down to 6 populations left in the UK. That was the first year I saw one actually on Salisbury Plain, but sadly that Salisbury Plain population has since gone extinct. So there's down to 5 populations, but then the one on the Somerset Levels just seems to be fizzling out. There have just been the odd bee seen in the last few years. So this bumblebee is disappearing before our eyes, and these declines are continuing into the future, unless we do something about them, which I'll come to shortly. You may be wondering why it matters if insects decline. Most people don't like insects very much, but actually it matters enormously. The world will grind to a halt if we lose our insects. Insects make up 2/3 of all species that we know of on the planet. And then they're food for a great number of the creatures that aren't insects, things like birds, many species of bird, bats, lizards, freshwater fish like salmon and trout, and so on. They all depend upon insects, so if the insects disappear, then they're going to go too. And in fact, we've seen disproportionate declines in populations of insect-eating birds. Things like the cuckoo, down 77% since 1966, and the poor old spotted flycatcher, which I can remember as a common bird when I was a kid. It was there, we had them in my garden, and they're down 93% since 1966. In fact, I mean, this is one of the most alarming statistics. I saw a recent calculation based on data from the British Trust for Ornithology for breeding bird populations in the UK, that the number of breeding birds in Britain has fallen on average by 91 birds per hour since 1966, when we won the World Cup, and I was 1 year old. So throughout my life, we have lost 91 birds an hour on average. Absolutely terrifying. And of course, if it carries on, there won't be any spotted flycatchers or cuckoos or swallows or so on. Okay, so insects are important as food. They're also really important for lots of other things. They're biocontrol agents, they're recyclers of dung and dead bodies and trees and leaves and so on. They keep the soil healthy, they distribute seeds, you name it, they do it. They also, of course, are pollinators. That's the one thing that insects do that is widely recognised. They pollinate most wildflowers. 87% of all plant species on the planet need pollinating by some kind of animal, usually an insect. In Europe it's always some kind of insect. And 3/4 of the crop varieties we grow depend upon insect pollination to some extent. So most fruit and veg depend upon insects. We've become used to our supermarkets being replete with this amazing selection of fruits and veg, often flown in from around the world. They wouldn't be there if it weren't for insect pollinators. We wouldn't have things like apples, cherries, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, tomatoes, chili peppers, pumpkins. I could go on and on. Even things like coffee and chocolate depend upon insect pollinators. So, I mean, not only would life be pretty sad without them, but actually the brutal truth is we couldn't feed everybody. People would starve, millions of people would starve if we didn't have insect pollinators. So that's enough doom and gloom. Sorry if that was a bit depressing, but I need to explain how serious the situation is, in the hope of motivating you and others to do something about it, to join me in reversing insect declines. So what can we do? Well, there's lots we can do. That's one of the nice things about this subject, actually. Lots of, these big environmental issues, people feel helpless, but actually everyone can get involved in solving insect declines. And one of the most obvious opportunities is to invite insects in to urban areas, to make our towns, our villages, our cities, our gardens more insect friendly. There are 22 million private gardens in the UK, covering an area of about 400,000 hectares. And just imagine if they were all insect friendly, full of the right kinds of flowers, native wildflowers, pesticide free, maybe with a bee hotel and a little pond and so on. That would be an amazing amount of resource. It's a bigger area than all of our nature reserves in the UK. And the exciting thing is it's already happening. There are people making their gardens more wildlife friendly. They're deliberately buying plants to feed bees and butterflies and so on. So it's already happening, which is really exciting, but we can accelerate the process, and councils can really help. Because there's also a lot of urban green space that could help to connect the gardens, the road verges, the roundabouts, parks, cemeteries, all sorts of spaces that could also be inviting in nature to live in them. And together, collectively, that could provide a national network of wildlife-friendly, insect-friendly habitat. This is something I'm really excited about because I think it's doable, it's achievable in quite a short space of time, and I've written books about it. Forgive me for plugging my own books. The Garden Jungle and Gardening for Bumblebees. Anyway, gardens and urban areas can be surprisingly rich in biodiversity. People tend to think that biodiversity lives in the countryside, but actually, sadly, it doesn't terribly much. Much of our intensively farmed countryside is fairly devoid of life. And often there's more in urban areas. And one of the best examples I can think of is from Leicester, where a lady called Jenny Owen spent 35 years counting and cataloguing every species she could find in her garden. Not just insects, but plants and animals and of all types. Her grand total after 35 years, and this was in an eighth of an acre garden in urban Leicester, so nothing terribly impressive. Her grand species count, 2,673 different species, of which 1,997 were different types of insect. Isn't that amazing? I mean, that's the sort of diversity I would have guessed you might find in a rainforest or something, but no, it's in urban garden in Leicester. So cities have potential to support an awful lot of life if we just manage them the right way. So what is the right way? Well, we need to grow the right kinds of plants, both in gardens and in amenity plantings in urban areas, which generally means old-fashioned cottage garden varieties, perennials, biennials, herbs. There's loads of advice out there, my books and YouTube videos, and plenty of other sources of information on the best plants to grow to encourage insects in urban areas. We should also try to be more tolerant of weeds. You know, a lot of money and time is spent on eradicating certain plant species, things like dandelions, ragwort, thistles, and so on. And it's seen that you know, you're a bad gardener, or the council's being lazy if there are lots of these plants growing. But actually, they're native wildflowers, and they're astonishingly, well, I think they're rather pretty, but they're very attractive to wildlife. So take, for example, dandelions, which we do an awful lot to get rid of, usually not entirely successfully. Dandelions, beautiful, aren't they? Look at them. And also it's native, and dandelions are a really good source of nectar for pollinators in the spring when they've just come out of hibernation. So, you know, let's just try to be a little more tolerant of these native wildflowers. We can get rid of all the weeds in our cities just like that by renaming them wildflowers. Other things we can do. So how about having more flowering trees in our urban areas? How about fruit trees, plums, apples, pears, cherries, and so on, in our parks, replanting some of the avenues in our streets so that kids can pick an apple on the way into school. And of course, these fruit trees, they provide this beautiful blossom in the spring. They're a fantastic food resource for pollinators, things like queen bumblebees that have just woken up after a long sleep and they're desperately hungry. And then if a flowering tree provides them with thousands of flowers full of pollen and nectar for them to feed on. And of course the bees return the favour by pollinating the flowers and ensuring we get a fruit crop. Wouldn't it be great if we had more fruit growing in our cities? There's also, of course, the issue of mowing. So many urban areas have a lot of mown grass, and typically it might be mown 6, 7, 8 times a year by contractors who come in, and it uses petrol, it's obviously manpower, and it often isn't necessary, or at least the amount of mowing could be massively reduced. So this is an example from Stirling, where there's a local campaign group. They call themselves On the Verge. You can see their little sign there. And they spend their weekends digging over any bit of amenity grassland that they can get permission to attack from the local council, planting it with wildflowers. So there's a road verge. It used to be boring mown grass with very little biodiversity. Now it's teeming with flowers, bumblebees, butterflies, hoverflies, you name it. And there's a road verge created by the same team of people. At the last count in the city of Stirling, there are 93 flower patches like this dotted around on roundabouts and road verges next to a rugby pitch, in a primary school yard, even in the women's prison. And On the Verge Stirling has spawned an offshoot, On the Verge Cambridge, which is doing similar stuff in Cambridge. Wouldn't it be great if this was happening in every city? And obviously councils can encourage it. Instead, what I'm sad to say many councils do is this. They have, you'll probably recognise these pictures or recognise what they are. That dead grass is herbicide damage. These plants have been sprayed with probably Roundup, glyphosate-based herbicide. Now, if you look at, for example, on the right there, that silver birch tree, there was a bit of grass growing around the bottom of it. Maybe there was a dandelion or two, who knows. It would have supported a little bit of life. But now it's dead. It looks awful. Why was that necessary? This just seems like crazy environmental vandalism to me. Many councils employ teams of people to tour the streets looking for anything green and killing it. Why is that a good idea? What's more, if you look at the middle and the left-hand examples, These are children's playgrounds. Now bear in mind glyphosate, Roundup, there's a growing body of evidence that it's a carcinogen in humans, that it causes cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma to be precise. And we spray it on the spray equipment in playgrounds. That just seems completely nuts to me. I would ban pesticides in urban areas completely. You may think this is going a bit far, but there are the French have already done this. They banned all pesticides in urban areas in 2018, and France is doing okay. Paris hasn't been overrun with dandelions. There are several cities in the UK that have signed up to phase out pesticides, places like Brighton and Lewes, near where I live, and several London districts are doing the same. So why don't we do this nationwide? Wouldn't that be fantastic if every council came on board, stopped spraying weeds in the streets, and homeowners stopped spraying in their gardens? I've actually started a petition asking government to ban urban pesticide use, and we've got 39,000 signatures so far. It's on the government website if you're interested in signing it. We just don't need pesticides in urban areas, and if you're interested as someone who works for a council in trying to go pesticide free in your area, you can get advice from Pesticide Action Network, PAN, which is a really nice organisation that specialises in explaining how you can manage weed populations, for example, without using things like glyphosate. So check them out. Another thing that councils can do is encourage people to grow their own food in allotments or in their garden for that matter. There are currently about 90,000 people on waiting lists for allotments. Now why are allotments good for insects, for biodiversity? Well, there was a recent study from Bristol University, but a nationwide study, found that allotments are surprisingly rich in biodiversity. They compared them to gardens and to city parks and city nature reserves, and actually allotments came out top. They're fantastically diverse, and they're also producing food, which local, zero food miles, zero packaging, often zero pesticides food. So they're kind of dual purpose. They're supporting biodiversity and producing food and re-engaging people with food production, which seems pretty fantastic to me. So what a shame that so many people want to do this but can't get hold of the land. So I'd love it if more councils found a way to provide more land, particularly in and near cities, so that urban dwellers, so that everyone can get involved in growing their own food if they want to. Also, there are some really wonderful examples of city farms which are doing a similar kind of thing. So in Hackney, for example, you can visit the Hackney City Farm. It's open, it's free to anyone to go and wander around and see what's happening. There's a little cafe, there's a little shop where you can buy organic produce grown on the farm. And it's also just a fantastic place they take school trips where kids can go and discover how animals are farmed and how food is grown and so on, right in the centre of London. Similarly, there's a really cool project in Lambeth, Incredible Edible Lambeth, which isn't based on a particular site. It's more of a community of like-minded people growing food organically, trying to get the whole district to go pesticide free, sharing food. There's a food bank, sharing information. They're working with local schools, so the kids are growing their own food. A really fantastic way of re-engaging people with the whole issue of eating healthily, of where does food come from, of how is food grown and so on, at the same time of supporting biodiversity and not using any pesticides. Wouldn't it be brilliant if every city and town had something similar like that going on? Whatever we do, we need to look after our planet better. It's an extraordinary thing, this rock hurtling through space with a crust of life clinging to its surface. And we just take it for granted, we don't think about it, but it's everything we have. There really is no planet B. And it really worries me that our future generations, my kids and their kids, are going to live in an impoverished world, and their lives are going to be harder. We would do anything for our children, wouldn't we, apart from apparently leave them a decent planet to live on. So let's do better, and let's start by inviting insects in to live in our cities. Thank you very much for listening.